talk about some other things. To begin with, if you click on Federal Agencies Part 1, PowerPoint, you see the federal estate. So about 28% of the total land area in the U.S., that is about 640 million acres of land, are managed by the federal government. All western states except Hawaii have more than 25% of their total land area in federal ownership. And for the state of Nevada, about 90% of its land is managed by the federal government and owned by the federal government. The West, including the state of Alaska, accounts for just under 93% of the federal land in the U.S. So most of the federal lands in the U.S. are in the West, and Alaska has over 1/3 of the U.S. federal lands. By contrast, even though the East has a population of 75% of the U.S. population, only about 7% of federal lands are located in the East. And we have talked about why that is when we looked at the map of federal lands in the U.S. and also in Chapter 4, our history chapter. So this is a breakdown of the federal estate by agency. So we can see from this that clearly the Bureau of Land Management is the largest federal landholder with 267 million acres, followed by the Forest Service, and then the Park Service, then the Fish and Wildlife Service. The National Wilderness Preservation System, which was established by the Wilderness Act of 1964, set up this wilderness preservation system. And this is not new land, but rather wilderness represents a redesignation of land that was already managed by the federal government. And we can see here that the 4 agencies that manage wilderness, we've talked about this in class, are the Forest Service, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Bureau of Land Management. And Alaska's wilderness areas account for 58 million acres of land. So most of the, Alaska has it's the largest wilderness managing state. National recreation areas are not a legislatively defined system, but they are lands that have the word recreation in their titles. And these lands, these national recreation areas, are managed by the Forest Service, the Park Service, and the Bureau of Land Management. The National Trail System was established in 1968. This system includes 8 scenic trails, including 16,000 miles, and that includes the Appalachian Trail, the Continental Divide Trail, and the Pacific Coast Trail, among others. There are also historic and recreational trails as well. The National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, passed in 1968, I talked about last week, and this is the highest level of protection for rivers, and these are rivers that are not dammed. These are free-flowing rivers. And we can see from this table that the Forest Service manages the most miles of riverfront that are on national wild and scenic rivers, followed by the Park Service. And 11,000 miles of 166 rivers in 38 states and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico are in the National Wild and Scenic Rivers designation. This is a little more than 0.25% of the nation's rivers. So it's a small amount of the nation's rivers, and that is largely because these are free-flowing rivers that are in a natural state. I want to talk for a minute about some different programs that are federal programs that are often partnerships with state and local governments. So these are funds that can come to state and local governments through the federal government. One is the Scenic Byways program. If you've ever driven on a small country road, you might have seen a sign on the side of the road that said Scenic Byway. So this provides funding to local areas that have outstanding scenic qualities. And they may also include historic, natural, recreational, or archaeological qualities as well. And sometimes these partnerships that I mentioned between the federal government and local or state governments will also include nonprofit organizations and sometimes commercial interests as well. The Watchable Wildlife Program is what its name suggests, and this is a program that gives funds for sites that are good for watching wildlife and environmental education. And again, this program may involve all levels of government and partnerships with nonprofits and commercial interests. So, the National Park Service is America's best idea, as we've seen in previous videos. Yellowstone National Park was established in 1872, our first national park. And it took 44 years for the federal government to create an agency that would manage national parks. And so the National Park Service was born in 1916 with this mission: to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. And this, as we know and talked about from chapter 4, this agency was born out of the preservation philosophy and has very much a preservation and recreation vision as part of its history and its current values. Stephen Mather and Horace Albright were the first two directors, and they were very important in charting the path, the future of the Park Service. Some of the early problems with the Park Service were the wilderness versus access. Now, this is a continuing problem today. We've talked about this a little bit in class. Also, the explosion of competing tourist services, which led to what we call a regulated monopoly. There were many private interests that wanted to have a monopoly to provide lodging or food and supplies in national parks. And there were many conflicts over who would get contracts to sell in national parks. And there were a lot of early loopholes that allowed for wise use in parks. And as you remember, wise use is part of the conservation philosophy, not the preservation philosophy. There are 417 sites managed by the National Park Service, and these include natural areas, which have scenic and scientific value. These include national parks and national monuments and preserves. The Park Service also manages historical sites and military parks and memorials. So if you've ever been to Antietam Historic Park, for example, which is a Civil War era park, or many other parks around the country. The types of management areas that the National Park Service manages are recreation areas, largely. And these areas, if they're designated as only recreation, they do not necessarily have the features of national parks, but have their own exceptional qualities for outdoor recreation. These include national recreation areas, wild and scenic rivers, performing arts centers, national lake shores, and national parkways. So Blue Ridge Parkway is a good example. Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore in Michigan is another example I talked about in class last week. And here's a link to everything you want to know about the Park Service. Some of the recent and current controversies that the Park Service is facing include overdevelopment and air pollution in Yosemite and the Smokies in Great Smoky National Park. But this is not limited to only those national parks. There are many national parks where this is an issue. Water flows at Glen Canyon Dam in the Grand Canyon. When those water releases happen within the Grand Canyon, greatly impacts the quality of recreation of people doing river rafting trips on the Grand Canyon. It also impacts the ability for the river to revegetate in the riparian area. And this really is a seasonal problem or a seasonal issue. Also, wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone. Even though wolves have been reintroduced in Yellowstone and have been there for a long time now, it's still a controversy for cattle ranchers that live near the borders of Yellowstone because, of course, wolves don't observe property lines. Water diversion in the Everglades is a problem for the recharge of the aquifers and for those wetlands, for wildlife and water levels, and also for protection during storms, stream bank protections. Overflights in the Grand Canyon are a controversy because they can impact safety, but also the quality of many people's experience of the Grand Canyon, hearing airplanes overhead. Underfunding and entrance fees are a problem. If Congress doesn't renew funding in a reliable way for Park Service, then they develop a backlog of maintenance issues. Many people feel that entrance fees should be kept low so that all people will have access to the parks, but the reality is that Congress has been underfunding the parks, and so they rely more and more on entrance fees in order to maintain the parks for the public. There's also multiple use encroachment on the parks. There are many private interests that would love to get into the parks, and so they are getting closer and closer to the boundaries of the parks. And drones. Drones are not allowed to be flown in national parks, but they are often done anyway. Okay, so that is our first PowerPoint. We're going to move on to the second here. Federal agencies, continuing here, and I'm going to start here with the Forest Service and the beginnings of Smokey the Bear. So the Forest Service was created in response to the thinking that we could do better with our natural resources, and as you know, it was born out of the conservation philosophy. The Forest Service Reserves Act and the Organic Act were the two acts that helped to establish this agency. And its initial goal and purpose was to protect and secure a continuous supply of timber and favorable conditions of water flows. So this initial purpose has very much flavored this agency. It was officially created by Congress in 1905. It's housed in the Department of Agriculture, and I talked about that last week, why that is. Timber harvesting was its main purpose initially, and so since it's a wise use agency, it made sense to see timber as an agricultural product, an extractive resource. So timber harvesting has made the Forest Service one of the few agencies, one of the few federal agencies that actually makes a profit. Aldo Leopold and Bob Marshall were both employees of the Forest Service who really helped establish the wilderness movement. And the organization, the non-government organization called the Wilderness Society, was created out of their efforts in 1935. In 1957, the Forest Service launched Operation Outdoors, and the Smokey Bear Campaign was part of this. Smokey Bear Campaign was a fire suppression campaign. It really encouraged the public to be very careful about starting wildfires, and it also gave a lot of support to the agency for putting out any fires that started. Now, fire is an integral part of many ecosystems that the Forest Service manages. And so it took decades to realize the long-term impacts of this fire suppression strategy that was articulated in the Smokey Bear Campaign. We are seeing the effects of this today in some of the California wildfires we're seeing, and also in Oregon and Washington, because when we suppress the cycle of natural fires, then a fuel builds up in the forests, and so when we do get a lightning strike or a campfire gone out of control, we end up having hotter, more dangerous, and destructive fires than would normally be part of a natural fire cycle. The 1960 Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act recognized that timber, water, and minerals, and all these uses should be on equal footing. So we talked a little bit about how this can set up a dynamic where there's a idea of limited resource pie, and everybody's sort of fighting for their own piece of that pie. But this multiple use idea still continues today, even though the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management are evolving to a more systemic approach to natural resource management in ecosystem management. But you will still see references to multiple use management. Okay, the structure of the Forest Service is very similar to the military. It has one chief over 154 forests across 9 regions. It's a very top-down kind of agency. Some of the controversies that it deals with are endangered species protection, timber harvest practices, and managing riparian zones. I mentioned the Grand Canyon, and flows of water that will encourage or discourage the regeneration of riparian vegetation, increasing demand for recreation that puts pressure on the natural resources, but also allowing other forest practices to happen and along with recreation. So again, this is a multiple use management issue. And then livestock grazing. When my first trip to New Mexico, I pulled into the Carson National Forest near Taos in the dark to camp at a campground. And in the morning I woke up to cattle all over the campground. I had no idea that livestock grazed in national forests. Somehow I just never knew that, and it wasn't until I went out west my first time that I realized how important livestock grazing is in the culture of the West. I have mentioned fire management. This, of course, we are seeing the incredibly destructive wildfires on the West Coast this fire season, and a lot of that, as I mentioned, is out of this fire suppression strategy, but also the fact that more and more people have built homes and communities in the forests. There is a wildland urban interface that makes it very difficult for people to be safe when they're surrounded by combustible trees. And it's very hard for an agency like the Forest Service to keep people safe and to fight fires and to protect people's properties when so much development has happened in this wildland urban interface. Integrated pest management is another controversy, how the Forest Service has dealt with different pests. Sometimes they have used pesticides that would impact other wildlife. And so we can see that there are certain groups of the public that get upset about different ways that the Forest Service will manage resources like pests that impact their lands. There is increased crime in national forests and public participation in planning. The globe controversy, I have a personal story about this. My mother-in-law was a long-time environmentalist, and years ago, maybe about 15 years ago, the Forest Service had planned to do a clear cut in the viewshed of Blowing Rock in the Pisgah National Forest. And the federal regulations require that the agency advertise its proposed actions in local areas. But instead of advertising this in the Blowing Rock area, whose viewshed would be most impacted, they advertised in Lenoir because they knew this was going to be a controversial clear cut and that people would be very upset. Well, word got out that this is what they were planning to do, and my mother-in-law got some of her friends together and they helped stop and call the Forest Service on this cover-up. And it was very embarrassing for the agency, and it really affected people's trust in the agency. So that's what I mean by the globe controversy, and that clear cut never happened as a result of that. And the agency, as a result, has done an incredible job in their most current planning process for the Pisgah and Nantahala National Forests. We'll talk about that later in class in this semester. Also, there's more litigation, more lawsuits involving the Forest Service, and of course climate change is making management issues more difficult for the Forest Service. The Bureau of Land Management is the largest land management agency of the federal government, and many of its lands are the, quote, lands that nobody wanted. These were not the majestic lands of the National Park Service and the Forest Service necessarily. They do have some beautiful lands, but for the most part, the most beautiful lands are usually the ones that become national parks or are managed also by the Forest Service. It was pejoratively called, and still is sometimes called, the Bureau of Livestock and Mining, because many people in the public feel that livestock grazing and mining are the most important uses that the Bureau of Land Management allows. And so a lot of people take issue with that. This agency was established out of the Taylor Grazing Act. It was actually created in 1946, but this Grazing Act was set up to prevent overgrazing. It has a conservation and multiple use mission like the Forest Service, and it manages approximately 270 million acres. Some of the issues and controversies that the Bureau of Land Management faces are grazing allotments and fees. Some people feel that they should not have to pay fees to graze their cattle on federal land that belongs to everyone. I mentioned the takeover of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge was a controversy, though it was not a BLM land. The beef that those folks had was actually with the Bureau of Land Management about those grazing fees. There is also controversy about wild horses and burros, and many wild horses and burros inhabit a lot of Bureau of Land Management lands, and the agency has to figure out how to manage those animals along with wildlife. Hard rock and energy minerals leasing is a controversy. The General Mining Law of 1872 set up a system of mining and mineral rights that are underground, and even if people own land, the surface, they may not own the mineral rights, and others may own the mineral rights, and sets up a lot of controversy. There's also a checkerboard pattern of BLM lands. So if you look at a map of BLM lands in the West, you will often see checkerboard of private property interspersed with the federal property. This makes management very difficult. On the ground, what this can look like is private landowners who are surrounded by Bureau of Land Management lands or BLM parcels that are surrounded by private lands, and roads that go into these lands. Sometimes private landowners will lock gates and prevent the public from being able to access these federal lands. So makes managing these areas a lot more difficult for the Bureau of Land Management. Some of the new recreation demands that we didn't know before, things like ultralights, geocaching, even rock crawling, which are these giant vehicles that go on boulders that you wouldn't think would be possible to go over. So these create management issues that the agency has to figure out how to deal with. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was created in 1940, and with the Lacey Act of 1900, this is when we really began to manage wildlife in the U.S. In 1903, Teddy Roosevelt created the first National Wildlife Refuge, and then there were a couple of different acts that affected wildlife. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act actually protects migratory birds from harvest of their feathers or the whole birds. And the Duck Stamp Act was put in place to raise money for wildlife management. These place taxes on hunting and fishing. The passage of the Endangered Species Act in 1973 turned the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service into the most powerful conservation agency in the nation. And that is because the Endangered Species Act sets up an endangered species list, and that is known as and this Endangered Species Committee is known as the God Squad, because the people on this committee are the ones that get to decide what species are going to be listed on the threatened and endangered species lists. When a species is listed as threatened or endangered, a whole host of protections are put in place for that species, and it requires certain kinds of management and restrictions. The National Wildlife Refuge System, which is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, includes over 500 different national wildlife refuges around the country. These are public lands that you have access to. These include migratory bird refuges. I told you about one of my favorites, which is the Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge in Socorro, New Mexico. Also includes wildlife ranges and game ranges. So hunting and fishing do happen on wildlife refuges, and wildlife management areas and fish hatcheries. The Bambi syndrome is this idea, and Dennis talks about this, where people anthropomorphize wildlife, giving human characteristics and emotions to animals. This can actually affect the management that the Fish and Wildlife Service does. Sometimes to help an overall population of wildlife, say for deer, the Fish and Wildlife Service will recommend culling a certain number of animals. And to do that, they will offer so many hunting permits for that species. Part of the whole point of that is to protect the overall population, because if a species like deer are allowed to populate beyond the carrying capacity of the land, then animals start to starve. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service, their scientists are always looking at carrying capacity and trying to understand how many of a certain species a certain ecosystem can support. You can imagine this gets complicated and requires a lot of science. Okay, the water managers are the Army Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation. There's also the Tennessee Valley Authority. I'll talk about that in a second. But the primary purposes of these agencies are flood protection, hydroelectric energy, flatwater and whitewater recreation, water storage for agricultural, industrial, and domestic uses, and waterway transportation. So the dam building agencies are the Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers, and here's the Tennessee Valley Authority. This is a government-owned corporation, and it actually makes money through generating electricity in Tennessee, and it's had its own controversies over the years regarding endangered species. Some other controversies that these agencies deal with, specifically in regards to dams, are burying cultural heritage sites. When a dam is built and the water backs up behind it for storage, then a lot of sites are flooded. This also can block the movement of migratory fish, and dams always eventually silt in. The reservoirs silt in as a result of the dams, because silt sinks to the bottom and gradually fills in these lakes and reservoirs. Many dams cost more than they are worth, and dams and reservoirs also alter wildlife habitat. So trying to balance preservation and conservation, all of these uses of natural resources at the same time that these agencies are trying to provide for recreation needs, both motorized and non-motorized, can be a very difficult balance to strike.